You're listening to Pushing the Envelope, Life at the Cutting Edge of Customs Innovation. I'm Tom Muller with the Cross-Border Research Association. On this show, we explore the frontiers of customs creativity in conversations with customs and logistics experts, technology innovators, research scientists, and other leaders in the field. Industry insiders call this show the Pencast because it's part of PenCP, a network for boosting customs innovation founded by the European Union under the Horizon 2020 program. Today, it's my great pleasure to be speaking with Mr. Lars Karlsson, a global head of trade and customs consulting at Maersk, actually AP Møller-Maersk. And it's great to welcome you to the show, Lars. Thank you for joining me.
No, thank you, Tom. It's great to be here. You know, it's always my pleasure to talk about trade and customs and the world we live in. So brilliant to be here.
Well, you've come to the right place for that conversation, for sure. And I usually start off the conversation by asking, what my interviewees did to bring them into customs work, where this first place they start. But in this case, let's flip the script a little bit. One of the words you use in your LinkedIn bio is futurist. And I'm curious about that. So I'm gonna ask you to pull out your futurist crystal ball and take a look into the future. What does the supply chain, the worldwide supply chain, look like 5 years from now, and why?
Wow, what a great first question to a futurist that has a Palantir on his desk. Well, really interesting because I believe that we will see more changes the next 5 years to global trade than we've seen the last 50. And 5 years from now, I expect that we do see trusted supply chains, trusted value chains that are driven and powered by very powerful, intelligent digital trade corridors. And that means data pipelines that actually supports a number of various things and merge them into one end-to-end all through the supply chain, meaning multi-tier stakeholder data that is vetted. It means supply chain visibility data, meaning commercial data. It means all the elements we see today as on and off submission of data to various governments and borders. And of course, it will also mean that we see a number of the new ESG and environment, social protection and governance data being collected, being refined, being analyzed, being used and reused all through the supply chain. And what that gives us is really kind of trade superhighways. It creates various, as I said, trusted supply chain, trusted value chains, where it basically builds a trust badge of various stakeholders that you can build on trade compliance, customs compliance, various other things that carries along with the goods in a very integrated type of process. We are really creating 5 years from now, and 5 years from now, there's a passport for goods, right? That's the best way I can describe it. That actually brings that into kind of green trade corridors that actually makes it possible to move goods in a much more resilient, predictable way than today. That's only 5 years away. Could go faster than that.
That is amazing. Passport for goods. I like that as a concept. That's a big vision, and we're moving in that direction. But what do you think are the biggest challenges or the biggest threats to that vision becoming real in the next 5 years? I mean, we'll talk in a bit about Trade Lens, which is a fascinating and really valuable experiment, but that didn't quite cross the line. And I think a lot has been learned. That was just before you joined Maersk, I believe. But what are the big barriers or the big challenges that need to be overcome to make this vision a reality within 5 years?
No, absolutely. There are challenges, there's no doubt. And that's the reason why it hasn't happened already, because I was talking about this 10, 15 years ago as well, while the vision is much more pragmatic and much more realistic now, because it's all about data. It's all about digitalization. And of course, we all know that international trade wasn't the forerunner for various reasons. And we could talk an entire podcast about why that was the case and what has changed now. But one thing that has changed right now is the world around us, right? So we live with all these macros, from trade wars to protectionism to conflicts to global pandemics and container ships stuck in the sand or running into bridges. And all of those things that happens every day, the black swans of international trade, needs to be dealt with, needs to be handled. And that has accelerated digitalization of trade. It is going fast. The bad news, and maybe the challenge is, it's not going fast enough. So while we see, e-bills of lading being introduced and starting to pick up, while we see wonderful initiatives like the UK Electronic Trade Documents Act, which is a 2.5-page document that actually regulates the possibilities to do this digitalized, it needs to move quite quicker and faster. Why I'm optimistic about it now more than ever is the face that we've seen 3,000 trade barriers raised the last 3 years in the world. That's numbers that is acknowledged by most of the international institutions. And that might be more what we see on the ground. However, at the same time, we all know that trade is the driver of growth, job protection, job creation, poverty reduction. All these means that we know is good. And of course, that is the big driver today, that multi-corporate companies and international trade, and of course governments themselves, see this as a real strategic issue. Trade needs to flow, and to get there, it needs to be digital. That's what's going to drive digitalization multiple times, going much quicker than we think today. And we will need the killer applications and the visions to actually get there, but we will get there.
So the attitude, you're saying that the world around international trade has embraced data and big data and digitalization in a way that makes the next 5 years, it makes big change in the next 5 years more possible than they were in the past?
No, absolutely, right. And people do think that I'm an optimistic thought leader type of person, right? But I totally believe in this. And the reason is that, while it's been slow of picking up in international trade in general to move from telefaxed bills of lading and invoices to something different, is again, the world around us is moving so quickly. And of course, we will be able to piggyback on loads of things that is happening in societies, from, digital payments in developing countries to a lot of other things. And in fact, this world, I describe it as global trade 2.0 often, right? Because it has three things. One, it's digital, totally digital. Papers will be removed. It's just a matter of time. I'm not saying there won't be examples on certain borders and certain smaller geographies and so forth. That will still take a long time to get there. But in general, if we look at the big trade blocks and if we look at the big players in trade, that will go quicker than people think. And again, the second thing about Global Trade 2.0 is that we will start using industry systems and standards rather than trying from the regulator standardize things on their own. And that's the big, I think, mover of this trend that you can see already existing. It could be technical standards in a certain vertical or industry. It could be other things that also do the job from a trade, customs, border perspective. And when you start using that, you don't have to invent the wheel yourself and try to implement it in multiple geographies, which is the old strategy from, governments, international institutions, and so forth. And the third part is, of course, the trust element. Now we can start looking at trade compliance in a way. In summary, we are the first generation that can transform problems into opportunities. Nobody could. And I will just think that a slow starting a huge industry that has so much impact on people's day-to-day lives and countries' GDPs will actually be very quick adopter as long as you crack the codes of some of the blockers, and you actually will be able to move quicker because you'll just use things that is already there in the society around us.
That's fascinating. Now, you say industry systems and standards to drive, let's say, regulation from within rather than top-down regulation. Could you give an example of what would be a good industry standard that can be used for trade and customs purposes?
Yeah, no, the irony is that there actually are standards, and I've been working before, and we'll get back to that, and World Customs Organization setting standards for this. So we have certifications for trade compliance in the Authorized Economic Operator Program. There are various other kinds of certifications for various stakeholders, including today for one of the areas that used to be a kind of a black hole in the universe, meaning free ports, free zones, and special economic zones. And they have today, through OECD and World Free Zone Organization, their own certification system for those who want to be, transparent, compliant, and being part of integrated value chains and supply chains. So there's a number of these standards. There's also technical standards of various kinds that, again, why would you, if you already proven that you have a system-based control in place in a company, you have used it for various reasons, why wouldn't another agency area acknowledge that and say, I'm not going to ask the same question one more time? Now, what we're really saying is that instead of just looking at duplication of documentation or documents or formal submission of information sheets and like customs declarations, that's a good example because I'm a customs guy, right? But why we're looking at, first of all, looking at all the trade documentation that is in the international trade flow. Then we look at the customs declaration. Then we look at various declarations for other agencies. And then we say, let's digitalize all of those. No, of course we shouldn't. Half of them should be removed, not digitalized. And that is something I do see is starting to happening now, that we have a question saying that this kind of paradigm we created in the 60s, including, by the way, borders with gates that goes up and down, you have to stand in a queue and wait for, while we now know 3 weeks before what is coming, who has been touching it, what the value is of it, what risks are involved, all different type of, if it's a veterinary inspection or whatever has been on meat, has already been done. It's already attached as a badge to what is coming. If nobody touches that, and we can monitor it for 3 weeks until it hits our shores, 24/7, and we can at any time intervene, not necessarily at the border, but anywhere in the supply chain to actually make sure this is also what is happening there. If we do that, and then we take that into account, the trade compliance record of international trade, then, of course, we are in a huge, wonderful position to start using this digitalization developments that we see in all other parts of society. So we have basically the pieces of the puzzle. We just need to put them together and use these already existing instead of, again, coming up with a CBAM for carbon border adjustment mechanism in one place and then do a totally different one in another geography that is trading with the first one. That doesn't make sense. So standardization is one thing, but practical use of what's already there, it's how it's applied in an efficient way. That's how I see it.
Efficiency and trade-driven decisions rather than politics, let's say.
In one way. But it's also good politics, Tom, because it means that I'm sure European Commission, and I work with them, I say I'm still married to the same woman because I've been more in EU meetings than I've been home. It probably was good for my marriage, but, I've seen the process. You got to have respect for it. It's a long process, 27 countries these days, and it's enlarging as a trade bloc, biggest trade bloc in the world still. It takes time to do things, but why would you need to invent the wheel every time and try to implement it? The people there also have pressure on. The politics, the policymakers, the decision makers also have the pressure from public and consumers, buyers, their voters, to say, I want to go green, or I want to go, fair. I want to go this and this way. So application becomes more and more important for the people, all stakeholders involved in the process, rather than, I've done my piece now. Now I handed it over. It's up to you to implement it, which is the old model that we are going to more and more see disappear just because of efficiency reasons.
Yeah. Okay. So you said earlier it's all about data, and international trade really wasn't a forerunner in data digitalization and in forward-thinking data. Right. What is it about international trade that makes it less open to innovation in the data capacity? And to come back to the two-prong question, the politics. What happens if Trump gets elected in November and returns to the sort of protectionism policies that marked his first 4 years? How does the nature of international trade on the one hand and the unpredictability of politics on the other impact the possibility of implementing this purely logical, thoughtful 5-year plan that you're talking about?
That's a big question, where I would say it's probably 3 or 4 questions in there, your question, right? And I'll take them from the start. There are many reasons why it took some time to get digital, and it still does, right? We still see numbers that there's only 4 or 5% of the trade documentation that is digitalized, international trade. These are scary numbers, But we also got to realize digitalization of trade doesn't mean every piece of transaction in international trade, right? So we also know that it is a big number of, a limited number, I should say, of players that has a big impact on international trade if you look at the numbers. It's a number of countries, it's a number of big players, it's a number of movers of goods, including my own company, and many of our competitors and partners involved as well. So it is in one way a small world, and it's another way it's a huge world, right? So that's just to bear in mind. Now, the reason why it didn't pick up was twofold. One was the drivers was actually not in favor of exchanging data in the international trade for various reasons. And you know that, right? There's always been an element of where you exchange. I always say customs is the best business idea I ever come up. It's been there for 2,500 years. You draw a line on the ground, you say can't pass without paying. That is customs, right? It's a good business idea, right? And of course, while money is exchanged, we also know there are always ways of seeing what amount of money that needs to be exchanged. So of course there have been issues around intellectual, the integrity of the process, the corruption part of the project, and so forth, and many other things where you wouldn't, between the different partners of international trade, necessarily want to have the accurate data everywhere in the process, right? So in itself, it was local. That's the second part of it. So I'm only an exporter. I only care about getting my goods to B, not to Z. I only get it to the next point. I use a local broker. I use a local transporter. I use a local logistic firm. And that was good from one perspective for a long period of time because it probably optimized the cost for some SMEs and for many companies in one way. Because again, you just took the consequence of that being a very segmented, very, how should I put it, distributed type of and delegated type of process that really didn't fit together at all. It just was the next player I used in my chain actually knew what to do the next. And he knew what to do there. He knew somebody there. And then it just kept going like that. So that didn't in one way demand an exchange A to Z and a full scale of using digitalization from that point of view. Then, of course, there were a number of stakeholders in that specific type of setup that actually made business out of that. So what happens if somebody else can do 10 out of the 12 steps of that chain? That's not good for me, is it? So why would I contribute to that? So there's a kind of a mix of data being protected for the wrong reasons, because I don't necessarily want to send the right value of the goods to somebody who will also maybe take a customs duty or an excise duty out of that value, right? And there was those who just used the local setup of chain. Now, what has tremendously changed the last 10 years is, of course, not only the drivers around from a macro perspective, but it's also a fact that the value chains have changed, right? So production has changed. We started doing in Maersk 7, 8, 10 years ago, these type of alternative sourcing strategies and production strategies, right? To look at what happens if you have production in this country instead of that country, and how do you make that work, and how can you get a bigger picture work if you actually move from Europe to China with your production or whatever it was, right? And of course, we've done that for a long period of time. And of course, today, 75% of goods is going through these integrated value chains. If you're a small, medium-sized contributor to that, or you're the biggest company in the world in retail, doesn't matter. You're still going through these integrated value chains, and you're passing borders, and there's statistics to prove this, maybe 4 or 5 times during a production cycle. It's made in the world. It's not made over here and sold over there. It's actually made everywhere. Wherever you can get the sugar from, you'll take the sugar from. Wherever you take another part of that cookie from when you are producing that fantastic biscuit in the UK, wherever it comes from, it comes from. And it changes all the time. The pieces of this, of course, has changed entirely the dynamism. What we did not take into account was the fact, what happens when the macros hits this, when it's not facilitated enough? Then you start seeing delays, you start seeing problems with resilience, you have no predictability. Your end consumer is starting to say, okay, when is my biscuit coming, or when is my Nike shoes coming, or Puma shoes, or whatever it might be, right, arriving? Because that's the only thing I care about. Mm-hmm. And that has been the process right now, as you know, that we've started to do those types of change. We've started to do those type of end-to-end delivery. And I can talk more about what Maersk is doing, because we consider ourselves as a leader in this specific exercise right now. But everybody's doing this. And that, of course, means you cannot have that local distributed type of setup anymore, where, whatever is the cheapest I can do locally in step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 actually works at end and destination. It doesn't work anymore. So the difficulties becomes too big. So anybody in that food chain or that integrated value chain would start saying, this doesn't work for me anymore. So why are you using that one? How can I get away from that risk? How can I de-risk this from a value proposition point of view, basically from a functional point of view or for an efficiency point of view? So we're starting to see this change coming basically very, very fast, accelerating very fast, without people really noting it, without regulators thinking about it very much, without, again, the international system of trade changing itself. And what I think now is the difference is that industry, ourselves, we are starting to change it, because our customers, at the end of the day, you and me, when we buy stuff, it's so interesting. I'll give you a practical example and stop me if I talk too much here. I buy something online. That's what I do. And I always said border isn't a line on the ground anymore. Border is when somebody books a ticket online on my smartphone, or buy something online, again, from whatever device I'm using, an iPad. Okay, I buy something. I don't know where it's going to be what's produced. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know how it gets here. But it does. And I only want to know, when is it arriving, right? And it says 2 days or 10 days or whatever it is. And I say, that's okay. That's basically the decision making is, can I get it now or next Christmas? And if it says 10 days, I want 10 days. Now, what happens up until now is that I can get and I do, and you get it as well, a text message saying, oh, it's now in our store. It's now in our warehouse. We now picked it up from the warehouse, wherever that is. I don't care. A delivery truck has now picked it up in another country. I said, why are you telling me this? I want to know on Thursday when it arrives. But the interesting thing is the last mile of that delivery, we haven't solved that yet, because we haven't solved some of the border issues. It could be delayed. We haven't solved the last mile delivery, because what happens is that I get a notification that 1122 was taken out of a warehouse in London on a Monday. But when it comes to me, I get a text message saying, we're coming on Thursday between 8 and 5. And I say, I'm not home 8 to 5. Can you tell me 11:27 that you're coming? I say, oh, we can't. Because then another dynamism that wasn't connected to the rest of that supply chain was actually putting in place, where, how can I get to Lars Karlsson? Because I only have a guy that lives 10 miles away from him to deliver. I'll do it on Friday instead. And that's the logic coming in. And that is what is now changing, that the end-to-end is basically picking up all of these different elements and starting to become one end-to-end supply chain with data, which means we could be much better at saying, well, Tom, we come 11:27 on Thursday. If you have somebody home, then you can get your package, which at the end of the day, the end consumer is the only thing he cares about.
This concludes the first part of my Pencast conversation with Lars Karlsson, Global Head of Trade and Customs Consulting at AP Møller-Maersk. Tune in soon for the next episode of our talk. Thank you.